the G20 was created in 2008 principally to avoid another financial crisis. Well, now the leading nations of the G20 have brought the world into a self-made financial crisis. The goal for India as G20 president will be to bring the G20 away from geopolitics and back on track with its financial agenda. Will we do it? Or as we can guess from yesterday, there's a lot of development, a lot of the development agenda being brought into the G20. Is that necessary?
To imagine that the G20 was created in 2008 or thereabouts after the global financial crisis, and its agenda has remained at the level of finance ministers and the finance track and just finance is, frankly, to live in another world. Because G20 has expanded in its mandate. When leaders meet, when the summit level meeting, it's obviously well beyond the finance track. And if you remember, one of India's initiatives at the start of the global pandemic was to have a virtual G20 leaders summit. Prime Minister Modi proposed it on health, on dealing with the pandemic. So that tells you that the agenda has gone well beyond finance. Second, you characterize today's situation as another financial crisis. I think it's much more than that. In 2008, we had a global financial crisis. Today, you have a financial crisis. You have, quite frankly, an economic and trade model crisis, because it's what was accepted even in 2008 is no longer accepted in terms of trade. You have relatedly a supply chains crisis, because the pandemic and the Ukraine war have taught us what sourcing concentration and production concentration can lead to. People are looking to diversify. Including diversifying at home. All countries are looking at that. Alongside, you have war, you have a pandemic that has not ended. You have a tech transition, and you have climate change, which has, even the most ardent climate change skeptic after this summer, after what's happened in India and Europe, across into the US this summer, would have been convinced that we have a problem on our hands. It's impossible to imagine that 20 plus global leaders will meet next year and discuss only finance and not discuss all of this. So I think an entire gamut of issues stares us in the face, and we have solutions to some of them. We don't have solutions to many of them, but that will take up a lot of human capital before the G20 and at the G20 summit.
Thank you, Ashok. Chandrika, going again back to the G20, it will be led by 4 developing nations till 2025, right? We have Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa. This is an unprecedented combination and offers a fantastic opportunity for developing countries to ensure that the promises made to them by the G20 are fulfilled, because these countries are now going to be the powerful grouping with their own agenda that are going to lead the G20. How should India lead this opportunity?
Thank you, Manjeet. As you said, this is a fairly remarkable sort of coincidence of this sequence of 4 countries that represent between them not just a large swath of population, but also challenges that are fairly unique. And I want to talk about it. It's of course interesting that there are 4 developing countries, but the interesting fact is not just the nature of these countries, but that within them, and I think India encapsulates this to a great extent, within them they face challenges, development challenges that reflect priorities in both high income, middle income, and low income countries, often all at the same time and in the same context, right? And this is a reality that all of these 4 countries face. But more importantly, these are the realities that the countries that they represent, countries that are like them in a similar situation, also face. So I want to just highlight a few of them. And I think, Ashok, you made reference to some of them. But it's not just the challenge. So let's say if we take climate change, it's not just the fact of climate change and the challenge that that represents, but the fact that the balancing act that these countries have to do internally is, for example, with climate change, it is, you balance that with energy sufficiency, which is a real and growing need in a lot of these countries. With biodiversity loss, you balance that with economic expansion, geographic economic expansion. How does that, the difficult choices that throws up. There is the Sustainable Development Agenda, particularly human capital formation, which comes with resource constraints as the balancing factor. And there is income inequality, which is both across countries, but also now increasingly within each of these countries as an issue to tackle. And in terms of opportunity, there is the role of technology and what countries like India have shown is possible to solve some of these problems. So this is about not just the articulation of these challenges from the perspective of these countries, but also solutions that would be relevant for the populations that live in them. And that's a very different articulation from something that is sort of designed at the level of a high-income country, because the perspective is very, very different. And so what this gives us is the opportunity of continuity, of articulating these issues in a way that reflects our interests, but also continuing that articulation for a 4-year period. So you can really make some substantial progress on each of these issues through the 4 presidencies.
What do you think India should do to lead this?
So I think exactly formulation of that platform, right, in terms of what is it that will persist beyond the 1 year that we are leading this process, but doing that in consultation with the subsequent presidencies, so that that reflection is both continued, but it also, we can actually articulate it, because what we are experiencing is what a lot of these other countries will at some point experience, and we have some answers which should be at the forefront of that articulation.
Okay. Thank you, Chandrika. Brigadier, how do you see the new world order emerging? We've talked about this yesterday. How much will it change the long-held status quo by the West? I'm just jumping from topic to topic because all these people bring very, very different and important perspectives. So how will this change the long-held status quo by the West, and what impact will it specifically have on India? Is India becoming more realist in its global policies as a consequence?
Thank you. From my perspective, we have to be realist. The global order has been in state of shock since 2019. First, we were dealing with pandemic, global pandemic, huge amount of human misery. We were just about coming out of it, and travel was starting, business was going on, offices were opening up. And then we have this Ukraine war, which is changing the entire normative system of the global order. Although it's a Eurocentric war, but it is impacting the entire globe, particularly because of the sanctions and the way the proxy war is being conducted. It's created the shortages of core resources, energy, fertilizers, wheat, etc. So, and more importantly is that what we are now seeing is that while we think that the G20 is the core forum which is going to solve global problems, but the agenda has been hijacked by G7. G7 is the core player which is now setting the norms of development and ensuring that we have the kind of systems that they want to put in place. And there, again, it's a contest between the so-called rule-based order and what the West perceives as anarchist order, or what the global commons order which the Chinese talk about. So there is this whole construct of competition that is emerging between these two orders. And this is also breaking the world up into 2 blocks. We have the Western bloc, which has got a European leg led by NATO, and then there is the southeastern or the eastern leg, which is in Indo-Pacific, based on the American Indo-Pacific strategy. So within that, there is the China-Russia entente, which is shaping its own order mostly in the continental construct, but also incrementally moving into the maritime construct. So, and along with that, there are small minilaterals are emerging. For example, Russia, China, Iran, they have their own salience. So what we are now witnessing is a global order which is in a total turmoil. And I do not think that the G20 summit in 2022 or 2023 would be able to create enough heft to change this system as it exists today, we will have to work along with the major powers and major players and use, like you rightly said, the collective power of these four developing countries to push them to an agenda which is more globalist agenda, which not only takes care of the West or the so-called East, but of the have-not South, which has suffered the most. So this is the kind of environment that we live in, and we need to recognize this fact. Thank you. India has been following what I call a balancing strategy. We have our relationship with the West, with the United States, part of our bilateral partnership with the United States, part of the quadrilateral. Then we are also a member of the New Economic Forum, and there are a number of other initiatives that we are partners in. The whole idea of India's relationship with the United States basically is to create a reasonable, stable, and a balancing environment in Indo-Pacific. That's our immediate clear aim. We are also have a good relationship with Russia. Russia has been our strategic partner, and today Russia has helped us to alleviate some of our immediate problems, particularly that have emerged from energy and other resources that we have been looking for, and otherwise we would have had to become a much higher energy bill than we are right now being able to pay. So the question basically is this, that between these two, India has been able to balance itself properly, and also the fact is that we have not taken sides in this contest, and we have tried to follow what I call a policy of equidistance from both. But the point at issue is that while we have a global standing, is that big enough to make a difference? Because when we are dealing with these big powers, they are going to act in their own interest. And if you want to see as an example, no big player till date has taken the initiative, neither of these four powers which we are talking about have taken the initiative of bringing about a peace in Ukraine. We are not even taking the initiative to say, hi guys, let's stop this war. We need to stop this war and get on with the world, because the world is suffering a lot. Thank you.
You're absolutely right, and that brings us to Manpreet, an important question. There's been a lot of talk about nuclear war, Russia, the facilities in the Ukraine, etc. So it looks like nuclear is back on the table militarily. Has the risk of a nuclear conflict increased in the past year due to events in the Ukraine, the Taiwan incident, Iran's continuing nuclear threat, and not to mention the proliferators of North Korea and Pakistan, which are keeping quiet for the moment? Will the current restraint on nuclear weapons hold?
I certainly hope so. Thank you so much, Manjeet. Indeed, the nuclear noise today is much more than what we've seen during the peak of the Cold War. You know, we are in a period which is sharply polarized. All my panelists have pointed that out. Great stresses in the interstate relationships. Now, some of this has been evident for a period of time. In fact, nuclear modernization, the buildup of capabilities and numbers in the nuclear arsenals of many of the 9 nuclear weapon states has been evident for almost a decade by now. But what we see today in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is calling attention to nuclear weapons. You know, earlier countries were doing it by themselves. They were doing it on the quiet, mostly, and there was some signaling which was evident once in a while. But what Russia has done is to draw attention to the nuclear weapons, you know, with having gone into the conflict, after having conducted a nuclear exercise. On the 4th day of the conflict, it said it was raising the alert levels of its nuclear forces. And over these 5 months now, military and political officials of Russia have constantly gone on saying that the use of nuclear weapons is on the table. It's not surprising, given that the objective of Russia is essentially to hold the US and NATO at bay, to let them know that interference beyond a point will not be taken, and therefore Russia is making, you know, all these nuclear threats. So while nuclear weapons use has not come into play, there's no physical use of the weapon up till now, I think there are two things which are very clear. One of them is that the value of the nuclear weapon has certainly gone up. So more and more countries are likely to look at nuclear weapons, particularly the nuclear weapon states, as providing them with a certain amount of immunity for what they want to do, like what Russia's managed to do to a non-nuclear country. At the same time, the non-nuclear weapon states are going to be looking at nuclear weapons with fresh eyes. So we already have statements, coming out from influential voices in Japan, in South Korea, which have said that nuclear weapons is perhaps the way they should be handling their security. North Korea certainly is not going to denuclearize, I think. It understands the value of the weapon and what can be done when you have that weapon. Iran could be looking at how it might want to exercise an option of keeping itself open to the prospects of having a nuclear weapon in the future. And we don't see the Iran deal making any progress as a result of very hard positions being taken by both the US and Iran. So the political utility of the weapon has certainly shown up as a result of the conflict. But I think what this conflict has also shown is that there is a lack of military utility of the weapon. That when you want to find the right target for actually using the weapon, it's very difficult to do so. Because you can never do that without bringing harm upon yourself, particularly when you're dealing with other nuclear weapon states. And that's a lesson I'm sure that many countries are going to be taking, that the military use of the weapon, the threat of the use of the weapon is more important than the actual use of the nuclear weapon. So therefore, balancing out on what, on what kind of an arsenal build-up that is necessary. Now, to place this in the context of India's G20 presidency, the grouping was formed in the post-Cold War world. It hasn't seen the kind of stresses that we are seeing today politically, and I quite agree with Mr. Malik when he says geopolitics is going to be a part of the financial considerations, the economic issues that are going to come up. There's no way that we will be able to divorce the two. So the geopolitics of today's times is going to be an important factor here. And this is where India's diplomatic deftness in being able to be part of the of not being a part of any camp and of being able to reach out to countries across the world, to be able to do, deliberations with the global north and the global south, as well as the east and the west. And that's why the presidency of India at this, fractious time is going to be, I think, that much more important. And if we really can make something of it, it would benefit us and the world in general.
Thank you. That's a really good answer, which brings us back a little bit. I'm going to just continue with you. Is that nuclear is also back on the table as a power resource? So post Fukushima, there was been, it was everybody gave up on nuclear, and now Germany has recategorized it as a renewable source. So this is serious. What does this mean? And how can a non-renewable suddenly be made a renewable geopolitically? And what does this mean? Is this just transitory rhetoric, or is this for real?
So we are into 11 years after Fukushima. It happened in 2011, the accident in Japan, and there is certainly a resurgence of interest in nuclear energy, so many years down the line. I think the two primary drivers that are pushing the case for nuclear energy once again is one, climate change concerns. So you're looking for a low carbon source which would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions as we go into more and more electricity production. It's understood that nearly 27% of the greenhouse gas emission contributions comes from electricity production. And as we all understand in that pie chart, nearly 60% is coming from fossil fuels right now globally, which is pretty much the picture in many of the developing countries as well, including India. Nuclear forms a small sliver. Globally, it's at about 10%. In India, it's only about 2% now. Now, with electricity generation being such an important component of GHG emissions, how we produce electricity becomes very important. So therefore, climate change concerns is becoming one of the drivers for making the case for nuclear energy. The other driver is the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the way oil and gas has been weaponized. It has shown up the vulnerabilities of countries, and as we all understand, Europe was so dependent on the Russian oil and gas, wanting to make the transition from fossil fuels to greens by using gas as the transitional source of energy. But now with this transitional source of energy becoming a problem, and they're not having reached their targets of renewable energy, which was going to be, powering their economies, they are now beginning to rethink on whether nuclear should be the answer. You mentioned the case of Germany. When Fukushima happened in 2011, Germany decided it's going to phase out its nuclear power plants. 17 power plants were producing 22% of its electricity. And in 2022, this year, they are supposed to shut down all their nuclear power plants. So 3 of them are remaining, and by the end of this year, they should shut down. But given the circumstances that the world seems to be in, and particularly Germany, which is also talking about rationing energy, dimming lights, all of that, so then they are one of the countries with the European Union, which has said that nuclear should be treated also as a green source of energy. I don't think there's anything wrong in that. And what this kind of a taxonomy that they've brought in does is that it provides a level playing field for renewable energy as well as nuclear. So the availability of the same kinds of subsidies to nuclear then provides that cushion for the nuclear power plants to be built. And when you look at it from the level playing field, you realize that nuclear is better in terms of less land requirement, less resources that are necessary for building up the plants, particularly as this part of the world is looking at small modular reactors as the new emerging technology. It has a less carbon footprint. It has greater capacity factors than what solar and wind provide us. And most importantly, it is a base load source of electricity, unlike renewables, which are intermittent. And therefore, you need backup options, which largely come then from fossil fuels or from nuclear. So therefore, nuclear does have a role to play in today's environment. Whether it can go the full, go the whole way, and can it happen quickly enough, given the long gestation periods of nuclear power plants? That's where the problem lies. Also, very important problem that India also faces is that of public perception about nuclear energy. Because however, if you've had only 3 major accidents in 75 years of safe production of nuclear electricity, yet every time a Fukushima kind of incident takes place, it sets you back by many years. Today, the Ukrainian nuclear power plants, which are suffering as a result of the conflict, has again given a hit to nuclear energy in public perception, because people then start fearing, why go down this path? For India, I think the important thing is we need to spread ourselves on the energy basket. There is, given the kind of electricity requirement that we have, there is no way we can rule out any source of electricity. So renewables are very important, and I'm glad we are making very good progress on them. But going slow on nuclear will be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because it's just so important to have that component as well as part of the larger energy mix.
Thank you, and I'm going to come back to you with some questions on that. Ashok, we talked, when we had a discussion yesterday, we talked about multilateralism and globalization, both of which are now facing challenges as a consequence of what is of the last 3 years, 2 years. So India has been a beneficiary of both, and in terms of participation and investment. Is this bad timing for India, just as we're getting ready for our coming out party as president of the G20? Or do opportunities await? Are there lessons that we've learned? Are we ready to put them to use?
I frankly don't understand what you mean by coming out party, because yes, the G20 meetings next year will probably, if we are lucky, be the first post-pandemic completely physical, non-hybrid meetings, possibly. But in that sense, it's a coming out party for the whole world. But I wouldn't characterize it as a party in the sense of a celebration, because there are deep challenges in the global system, as we've discussed, and in India as well, which continue. Talking about globalization, yes, India has certainly been a beneficiary, but it's also been double-edged. We walked into globalization in the early 2000s or the late 90s, wide-eyed and with a lot of optimism. But frankly, the globalization and the big multilateral trade agreement story had begun to sour even some years ago, because we were leaving ourselves vulnerable to imports in even areas where we should have been competitive. There was obviously a subsidy which other countries were providing for imports, for exports. There was a deliberately low pricing, which was beginning to distort trade in not just India, but many other countries as well. And frankly, there was a domestic pushback. Again, not limited to India. You can see it in the US and Europe. The pandemic really was a finale of that simmering mood, because what we saw in the pandemic was that supply chains got restricted because of lockdowns, and then there was also price gouging by certain producers in certain countries, largely in China. And this has led to the whole model of globalization being rethought. There is a quest for greater diversification, less and lower concentration of production and sourcing. Some of this concentration will be addressed by diversifying at home. Some of it will be addressed by diversifying with trusted partners in trusted countries. You can see that in the new trade agreements we're negotiating. You can see that with the pattern of countries we're negotiating with. We've signed a deal with a trade deal with Australia. We've signed one with the UAE, which will lead to one with the GCC. We are negotiating in good faith with the EU and with the UK. These will not be the wide spectrum trade deals of which may have been thought about in, say, 2000. These will be narrower trade deals, more functional trade deals, more fit for purpose trade deals, more feasible trade deals rather than free trade agreements. You know, feasible trade agreements is perhaps a better word. But the old model of globalization, quite frankly, is gone. I don't think it's coming back in a hurry.
On multilateralism, that is completely broken down.
Multilateralism, if you look at the whole UN system, the whole canopy of UN organizations, why was the UN set up? Why was it set up in 1945? It was set up to, in the post-war scenario situation, to keep the peace in the Euro-Atlantic zone, in Eurasia perhaps, in the Americas. And that area had seen 2 wars in 1 generation, and there was a desire to prevent further wars. Today, the whole definition of security has changed. It's changed in terms of geography. It changed in terms of domains. So if you're worried about security today, you're not worried about a war in Europe, though we are in the middle of a war in Europe. I appreciate that. You are also worried about health security. You're worried about climate security. You're worried about food security, which has destabilized a government to our south and caused a mini revolution there. You are worried about technology security. You're worried about biological nuclear threat. And frankly, a nuclear threat may or may not emerge. A biological terror attack is much more likely, actually. And you're also seeing a diffusion of the definitions of traditional and non-traditional security. It's almost an osmosis between them, because do appreciate that the response to a biological attack by a state or a non-state actor and the response to the pandemic will be very similar, because in the end you'll be faced with an unknown pathogen affecting a large population. So some of the resources and the capacities you'll have to mobilize rapidly will be the same. So preparing for a pandemic, for a future pandemic, and preparing for a biological attack overlap enormously. I don't think the Security Council as it exists today, or the whole definition of security as it exists today in the multilateral system, and this is just one example of where the system is out of date, quite comprehends all of this. In 2020, the UN Security Council wasn't ready to discuss the pandemic because it wasn't sure whether it fitted into the traditional definition of security. And the pandemic was the biggest event, the biggest shock to the system since World War II. And yet, we weren't sure whether it was security in any sense of the term and ready to be discussed at the UN Security Council. So that does tell you that multilateralism needs to be upgraded. By upgrading multilateralism, I don't just mean make India a permanent member of the Security Council, because frankly, if you make India the 6th member of the UN Security Council and nothing else changes, then you still have a problem. So there is a much, much wider gamut of issues that we need to confront.
Thank you, Ashok. And Chandrika, just coming to you, we discussed this also yesterday, preparing for the next pandemic, exactly what Ashok said. What can India do for its own system? A, what can the world do? What can India do, and how can we use our unique advantages? We have many. The world's largest vaccine maker, generics maker, diversity, etc. So,
Manjit, as Ashok said, the pandemic was a shock to the system. And there isn't a single example, I would say, of a country that had a textbook response, partly because the pandemic changed forms in so many ways over the last 2 years. Some countries did well at certain points, other countries then did well in other ways. So we don't have actually an example of one country that you can say got everything right through the entire course of the pandemic. And it's not entirely over yet. It's hopefully at a stage where now it is less disruptive, but we're still not entirely sure that it's behind us. But I would say if you look at the last 2 years, there are about 5 factors that determine whether there's been success or failure. So the first is overall state capacity, right? So do governments have the ability to mobilize and implement and respond very, very quickly to a fast-changing environment? So that's kind of one that's been, so countries that have done well are ones that have been nimble in their response. And so that's one factor. A lot of things go into that, decades of state building, technology. In some of those areas, we've done quite well. And I would say the vaccine response, and particularly COVID and what COVID has allowed us to do, has been an incredible example of success. The second, I would say, the second factor is a strong, robust, and a deep health system. And we've seen this across the world, that has been a necessary, but it's not been a sufficient condition to manage the pandemic. But it's a necessary condition. So countries that typically have had very poor, under-resourced, stressed health systems have fallen apart faster or have had a harder time seeing out the pandemic over the last 2 years. Countries that have had that depth may have had points of stress where the system was not able to cope, but overall they've done better. The third factor, I would say, and this is the strategic advantage of actually getting over a pandemic, is depth in scientific R&D and the ability to find solutions to completely new biological problems. And this is an area where I think actually the G20 countries, India being a prime example of this, should invest far, far greater resources so that we are not dependent on solutions that come from 1 or 2 parts of the world, but that there is the kind of expertise and the depth. And this is a long-term thing. This will not happen overnight, but we at least have the ingredients and the sort of building blocks for that. And we're very, very advanced in R&D. We're not right there in terms of the cutting-edge work that happened with the development of these vaccines, but we did develop our own fairly quickly as well. So we have the potential, but there should have been 10, 15, 20 vaccines coming out of India at the same time, or at least at the same level of development. And I think that is something that's been a big lesson. The fourth factor is the consequence of that, which is the manufacturing strength and capacity. And that's been our biggest strength, the fact that we had the ability to produce vaccines for the world. And for ourselves, I think the pandemic and our experience with it would have been very, very different had we not had the manufacturing capacity to be able to be self-sufficient and not rely on imports of vaccines or purchases internationally, because that would have, and we've seen the consequence of that in Africa. It's still about 16% of coverage for first dose of vaccines on the subcontinent, on the African continent, which is, at today's time, 2 years in, you would expect that problem would have been solved, but it hasn't been because the continent is reliant externally. I mean, Africa today imports about 70% of all its vaccines through Gavi, not COVID, but all vaccines. That's an incredibly weak position for individual countries to be in, where they do not have access to solutions internally. And then the final factor that when we look at country responses to the vaccine has been public trust. So the ability of citizens to trust their government, the ability of citizens to trust one another, to trust community institutions. And that, I think, has been the big divide between countries like the United States, where that trust is very, very low, versus countries in Southeast Asia, let's say, or South Korea, where that trust is reasonably high. And I think we've fallen somewhere in the middle, more on the side of the Asian countries in terms of public trust in the system. Now, all of these things take time to build, but I think what we can do in the next few years is to try and ensure that as we prepare for the next, whether it is a biological, whether it's a pandemic or a bio attack, that we start putting in place pieces of these 5 pillars so that we, as both us as India, as well as in terms of the lessons that we've learned. I mean, South Africa has given us a great example of surveillance systems and how strongly they've built a network of surveillance systems, which we saw towards the end of last year. To how do we actually build those capacities within our countries in a both complementary way so that we are supporting other countries in the global south, but also as a diversification strategy. So we're never in a situation where the solution to ending a pandemic depends on one country in the world. That should never be the reality. And just on that point, and I know that this is a little bit away from the topic, but as I was hearing the other panelists speak, I do think that one of the big representational gaps right now in the G20 is Africa. We right now only have South Africa as a member, but having the AU being represented on the table as the EU is, or having the AU nominate countries is going to be incredibly important to actually develop this platform and to make sure that we are actually solving problems for where the bulk of the world population is going to be moving forward.
Please, Ashok, you wanted to come in?
You know, I must say I agree with a lot of what Chandrika has said. I was involved a little bit with the vaccine, with the pandemic response within the government. A lot of us were tasked with different parts of it. We got a lot of things right. Our capacity was ramped up fairly quickly, especially in that lockdown period. Our technology response, both in terms of delivery of welfare and COVID, as she put it, was very good. Our vaccination, once it started moving, moved very rapidly. But I'd just like to caution people here from this idea that we are self-sufficient in vaccine manufacture. We are one part, a very, very important part of a very, very complex global supply chain. We can produce 5 billion COVID vaccines per year today, which is great. But please understand what this actually means. We produce good, high-quality, cost-effective vaccines here in India for COVID and for many other diseases. In the early summer of 2021, we were told by our vaccine manufacturers, our ministry was told, that we are dependent on sub-ingredients and ingredients from across the world, from about a dozen countries, to make vaccines in India, to make specifically Covishield, at that point Covishield, Covaxin, and Covovax, the Novavax vaccine, which was then about to be made in India. 360 sub-ingredients from about a dozen countries were in short supply across the world. 200 from the US, 100 from Germany, and the other 40-odd or 50-odd from Denmark, Poland, Japan, the UK, a variety of countries. All of these were in short supply. Why were they in short supply? In some cases, there were export restrictions, like in the US. But in all cases, there was actually a big capacity constraint, because a small sub-ingredient manufacturer who was contracted to make 3 million a year, 5 million units a year, was suddenly being told ramp up to 6 billion. And they were finding it impossible. So without those sub-ingredients coming in, without our ministry and our foreign ministers speaking to foreign ministers and governments in all of those countries, especially the US. One of his visits to the US was focused entirely on smoothing the sub-ingredient supply chain. Without that happening, we would not have been able to manufacture those vaccines. So we are far from self-sufficient in vaccine manufacture. No country is, as she's correctly put it. Global cooperation is absolutely necessary in public health in the coming years and in anticipating and preparing for any future pandemic, including, of course, for future vaccination.
Thanks, Ashok. Brigadier?
Yeah, I just want to highlight a couple of points regarding India's presidency as G20. From my perspective, the most fundamental point is that India should help in shaping an agenda of an inclusive and equitable post-pandemic recovery, as inflation is moving beyond food, energy, and world economy. And as far as the pandemics are concerned, we should not only focus on pandemics, we should focus on total health security capacities. Today it was COVID, tomorrow it will be something else. So it will need to be working on a total health capacity, developing a health capacity infrastructure. And in this field, India should provide its own capabilities and capacities to, particularly to the global south, in ramping up their capacities and also bringing up industries and putting up plants and resources to ensure that we can develop this agenda. Another issue is that what the world is also facing is the aspect of this debt trap. Now, we also have to look at this issue. This issue is becoming a very serious dilemma. We see what is happening in Sri Lanka. We see what is happening in Bangladesh is also seeing, and we also see what's happening in Pakistan. So there is this, the initiatives that are there for dealing with the debt problems of the countries. We need to involve ourselves and ensure that there is a mechanism put in place where the countries which are suffering as because of this pandemics or are helped in alleviating their debt issues. And also there has to be a certain degree of global consensus being built on the kind of debt which is being fostered on these countries, particularly let's take the BRI. Now the BRI is purely a political debt. It's not an economic debt, it's a political debt. It's a political debt because you are getting into discourse with the political leadership, investing money on projects which you are unable to fructify, or the costs of productions are so high and you are unwilling to, incapable of handling those costs. So the point is that we need to look at much broader spectrum of issues. Right now, the pandemic is at the back of our mind. We're just looking at the pandemic, but we need to create a whole lot of global capacities, both for dealing with inflation, economic issues, debt issues, as also larger health security issues, so that there can be, we do not, we help in proper developmental effort and leave behind a sort of a legacy as a part of our presidency. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 3 minutes. Actually, we're running out of time with 3 minutes for questions from the audience. So we had many questions that we still have to answer here, but let's move on to the audience. Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions at one time, and then, so we'll start from the left, the gentleman, and tell me your questions, and we'll stick to the point, please.
I'm Vasan. I look after the Chennai Center for China Studies and the National Maritime Foundation, Tamil Nadu chapter. I totally agree with Chandrika's point about inclusion of the African countries. She made a specific point to say that, G20 is incomplete unless you have representation from the African community. So that's a point which could be included in the agenda that India needs to push in the discussions during this year.
Question?
And the question is to Dr. Sethi. This is on the nuclear dimensions that you made. While there are efforts today to perhaps call it a renewable energy, and also you brought up the question about weaponization of nuclear power and the desire for states who do not have it to use it as a political tool. So, but with increased safeguards from the IAEA and others, that would be a difficult thing. We found ourselves that we can't even get into the NSG. So, do you think that, the question is that, do you think that you can have mechanisms to ensure that more people come on board for the renewable energy but not be weaponized? How can you ensure that?
Thank you. Please.
Hello. 2 questions for Mr. Malik.
Just one.
One question. So you mentioned functional trade agreements.
Can you identify yourself?
I'm Shashank Matu. I'm a junior fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. So you mentioned functional or fit trade agreements. That would be the feasible trade agreements. So could you unpack what that means in terms of, because for example, I work a lot with East Asia. They want to know why we're trading more with UAE and Australia, not with them as such. So just your sense on how these are functionally different from what we've done in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have some question? Yes.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Agnese Cigliano. I'm a fellow at Global Policy Insights. So I was considering two of the aspects that were mentioned. One of how the G7 still impacts the narrative and the agenda in the G20, but also the scarcity of vaccines and how the pandemic impacted the economics. So these are going to be two of the topics during the presidency of India for the G20. My question is, obviously there is criticisms around this, because one is the G7 has a very different experience in economics than the G20, and possibly countries like India have a growing trade of power, and also a lot to teach to global powers.
Ms. what is your question?
Yeah. What are possibly the criticisms that India will raise and how that will be affected, especially because, just mentioning about the pandemic, a lot of the scarcity with the vaccines has been because countries like the UK have been hoarding vaccines to a point where the entire population could have been vaccinated 3 times. So how will India tackle these issues? Thank you.
Okay. So let's start with Chandrika on the recent question on the scarcity of the vaccines. Move to Ashok and Manpreet.
I think there will always be hoarding. Let me just say, as a national strategy in the sense of a pandemic, the solution is not to necessarily focus on that alone. I would say the solution is to expand production and to decentralize production, so that you do not have a situation where there are a few countries that actually do have the monopoly of the control or control the supply of the vaccine. So I think that is a much more constructive path to go down, because in a fast-changing environment, there will be this kind of behavior is not unexpected. So I think the focus very much moving forward needs to be on how do you build capacity across the world, decentralized production, looking very closely at some of the supply side issues that Ashok raised, but also the more avenues you have for production of different subcomponents of different technologies, the more choices we have as a society, and individual countries have more choices. So I would say the answer is in strengthening capacity across the board, rather than focusing on this particular issue.
Thank you. Ashok?
Quite frankly, the vaccine situation it's not perfect today, but it's much better today than it was even a year ago. And as humankind, really, as a collective human society, we can draw great encouragement from how technology, scientists, researchers, and manufacturing capacities have responded to this pandemic. Yes, Africa is still suffering, I'm not denying that. But we've actually come a long way. And maybe in the next pandemic, God forbid, if we do have one in our lifetimes, we'll do it even better.
Ashok, on the unpackaging.
But on trade, the question you asked me, look, every country will have its own feasibility test. Okay, there's no one, that's the whole purpose of, no one will sign on to a large 100-country trade deal with a wide-eyed optimism anymore, with the hope that, this signing this trade deal will automatically create capacities for me to start exporting to the world. People will look for greater balance, that if I'm buying, am I being able to sell as well? And if I'm being able to sell, then I have more both financial and political capital to buy. So people will look for what can sell at home, what can be packaged well for domestic society as well. And this is a challenge all of us are facing. The US is facing it, India is facing it, all democracies are facing it. The only country not facing it is China.
Thank you, Mr. Vasan, for the question. So many mechanisms have been created to stop the chances of further proliferation. In fact, the US and USSR in the 1960s were on the same page because they didn't want more countries to go nuclear, and therefore the Non-Proliferation Treaty was crafted, and the NPT enforces that there will not be proliferation through the IAEA safeguard system, the International Atomic Energy Agency. But what we have seen is, despite structural constraints, where countries want to go nuclear, they have found the means to do so. North Korea, Iran are good examples of how that has functioned. Certainly, it's not in anybody's interest to increase proliferation, to have more countries with nuclear weapons, because unlike the cases of the bio attack or a pandemic where human capacities can be built to handle that kind of a danger, in case of an inadvertent use of nuclear weapons, because that's really the biggest concern, an accidental use of nuclear weapons with when more countries have nuclear weapons and the command and control systems are not how they should be, or where countries follow risky strategies of placing their nuclear weapons on high trigger alerts as a way of enhancing their deterrent strategy, then the chances of accidents go up. And if there was, God forbid, a nuclear accident or a nuclear exchange created by an accidental use of nuclear weapons, human capacities are not going to be enough to be able to handle that kind of a disaster. So therefore, I want to just end with a thought that I have for India's presidency. Now, India has always maintained that force should be the last resort, that you don't go into wars quickly enough for any kinds of actions, and India has shown that by example. So therefore, I think as the G20 president, what India can do amongst the many activities that will be undertaken would be to bring back the focus to peace over security. We have lost that. We are looking at security, building up our military hardware and our capabilities, but the fact that security can never be sustainable unless there is peace as well. So to bring back the focus on the peace agenda, I think could be one of the really tangible deliverables that will make a difference that India can bring to the table as part of the presidency.
This is a great way to end the session on a very, very optimistic note. So thank you very much, Manpreet, Ashok, Chandrika, and Arun. And thank you very much.